On a quiet Sunday morning in December 1941, paradise turned into hell. Pearl Harbor, a tropical jewel in Hawaii, erupted in fire and steel as Japanese bombers rained death from the sky. In just 2 hours, thousands lay dead. Battleships sank into oil-slick graves, and America was thrust into the deadliest war in human history. But Pearl Harbor was only the beginning. 4 years later, the United States would unleash a weapon so catastrophic that it changed the fate of the world forever: the atomic bomb. Was Pearl Harbor truly a surprise attack? And why did America choose to end the war not with surrender terms, but with a mushroom cloud? The morning of infamy, December 7, 1941. The day Franklin D. Roosevelt would later call a date which will live in infamy. At 7:55 a.m., 353 Japanese aircraft swarmed over Oahu, striking Pearl Harbor with bombs, torpedoes, and machine gun fire. The harbor exploded into chaos. The USS Arizona was ripped in half, 1,177 sailors entombed in seconds. The USS Oklahoma capsized, trapping hundreds inside. Oil fires turned the sea into a blazing inferno. Eyewitnesses spoke of men leaping from burning decks into flaming waters. Nurses at the Naval Hospital fainted from the smell of charred flesh. Families in Honolulu huddled in basements, convinced Japanese troops would storm the island next. By the time silence returned, 2,403 Americans were dead. Battleships lay broken, aircraft destroyed, and a stunned nation was awake to the grim reality they were at war. Mini cliffhanger. But was Pearl Harbor truly a surprise? Or had whispers of Japan's plan reached Washington long before the bombs fell, too? Shadows before the fire in the months leading up to December 1941. America had been inching closer to war. Japan's brutal expansion across Asia, the invasion of Manchuria, the rape of Nanking, its occupation of French Indochina, clashed with American interests. The USIMPOSED oil embargoes, freezing Japan's access to the fuel it desperately needed. Tokyo viewed this as strangulation, a death sentence for its empire. American intelligence had intercepted coded Japanese messages. Some officers suspected Hawaii was in danger. Warnings were issued, but drowned in bureaucracy, disbelief, and the arrogance that no nation would dare attack U.S. soil. And so, when Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's carriers unleashed their warplanes that Sunday morning, the U.S. Pacific Fleet was caught flat-footed. Case study: Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of Pearl Harbor, was later blamed for negligence. Stripped of command, disgraced, he spent the rest of his life demanding exoneration. But documents declassified decades later suggested Washington may have ignored key warnings. Was Kimmel a scapegoat? Or was Pearl Harbor allowed to happen, to shock America into war? 3. America awakens the very next day. Roosevelt addressed Congress. His voice thundered, "Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked." Congress roared back with a declaration of war on Japan. Days later, Germany and Italy, Japan's Axis partners, declared war on the U.S. Now, America was fully entangled in the global inferno. Factories switched overnight to wartime production. Women stepped into assembly lines, building tanks, planes, and bullets. Hollywood stars urged Americans to buy war bonds. Ration cards limited sugar, gasoline, and even shoes. By 1943, the U.S. military machine was unmatched. Thousands of aircraft rolling off production lines each month, massive warships leaving shipyards, millions of young men drafted and trained. Many cliffhanger, but victory would demand blood. And nowhere was this blood spilled more ferociously than on the islands of the Pacific. IV. Island Hell's The Pacific Campaign was unlike anything the world had seen. From the coral atolls of Tarawa to the jungles of Guadalcanal, Americans faced an enemy that would not surrender. At Tarawa in 1943, Marines waded ashore into chest-deep water, cut down by Japanese machine gun fire. In just 76 hours, 1,000 Marines were dead. Survivors said the sea itself turned red. On Saipan in 1944, when American forces overwhelmed Japanese defenders, Civilians were driven to mass suicide. Mothers clutched their children and leapt from cliffs, terrified of capture. One soldier recalled, "We tried to stop them, but they just kept jumping." Whole families disappeared into the sea. And then came Iwo Jima. February 1945. A black volcanic rock bristling with bunkers, tunnels, and artillery. For 36 days, Marines clawed forward yard by yard. Nearly 7,000 Americans died. 20,000 Japanese fought to the last man. The iconic photo of Marines raising the flag on Mount Suribachi became a symbol of victory. But behind it was carnage beyond imagination. Case study: Corporal Eugene Sledge, a Marine at Peleliu in Okinawa, described in his memoir how comrades lost their sanity amid corpses, maggots, and constant shell fire. He wrote, "We existed in an environment totally incomprehensible to those back home." His testimony reminds us the Pacific War was not heroic spectacle, but human horror. Fire from the sky. As the U.S. closed in on Japan's home islands, the war reached an apocalyptic scale. American bombers unleashed firebombing raids over Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya. On March 9 to 10, 1945, in a single night, 279 B-9 bombers dropped incendiaries on Tokyo. Wooden houses ignited like torches. Firestorms roared through the city. In 6 hours, 100,000 civilians were burned alive, more than died in either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Survivors recalled rivers choked with bodies, mothers carrying blackened children. The smell of roasted flesh hung over the ruins. Tokyo was a charnel house. Mini cliffhanger: if firebombing already slaughtered hundreds of thousands, why did the U.S. decide it needed an even more devastating weapon? VI. The Manhattan Project. Even as Tokyo burned, a secret project was unfolding. In hidden labs from Los Alamos to Oak Ridge, the Manhattan Project developed the deadliest weapon mankind had ever conceived. Under the guidance of J. Robert Oppenheimer, physicists raced to unlock atomic power. By July 1945, the bomb was ready. At the Trinity test in New Mexico, a blinding flash lit the desert, and a mushroom cloud clawed into the sky. Oppenheimer recalled the words from Hindu scripture, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." President Harry Truman now faced the choice: invade Japan at the cost of perhaps 1 million lives, or force surrender with this terrible new weapon. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay dropped Little Boy on Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., a sun was born over the city. In seconds, 80,000 people were vaporized. Shadows burned into walls, flesh seared from bone. Survivors wandered with skin hanging in strips, begging for water, their voices hoarse whispers. 3 days later, Fat Man fell in Nagasaki. Another 40,000 died instantly, tens of thousands more in the weeks after. Case study: a young schoolgirl, Sadako Sasaki, survived Hiroshima but later developed leukemia from radiation. She folded paper cranes, hoping to reach 1,000 for a wish of healing. She died at 12 years old, leaving behind 644 cranes. Today, her story is told at Hiroshima's Peace Memorial. The bombings shocked the world. Some call it necessary to end the war swiftly. Others call it the greatest war crime in history. The end of war, the birth of a new world. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed Japan by radio. The first time his people had heard his voice. He announced surrender, citing a new and most cruel bomb for the first time in history. Japan bowed to defeat. On September 2nd, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Allied leaders accepted Japan's formal surrender. World War II was over, but the world had entered a new age, the atomic age. The U.S. held a weapon that could obliterate humanity, and the Soviet Union, watching carefully, was already racing to build its own bomb. The Cold War was being born in the ashes of Hiroshima. The road from Pearl Harbor to Hiroshima was paved with fire and death. From the burning ships of Hawaii to the smoldering ruins of Japan, America had transformed from isolationist giant to global superpower. But while the U.S. had ended the war in the Pacific, across Europe another battle had already determined the fate of the world. The Red Army's march to Berlin. And that will be our next chapter Episode 2, The Red Tide, How the Soviet Army Crushed the Reich. Because to understand how World War II truly ended, we must follow the trail of blood eastward, into the heart of Nazi Germany, where the Soviet Union bore the heaviest burden and claimed the deadliest victory. Part 2, Stalingrad, the Eastern Inferno when the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor dragged the United States into the war. The Pacific became a raging sea of fire, but halfway across the globe, another inferno had already been burning, a war of attrition on the Eastern Front that would decide the very fate of Europe. And in that inferno, the Red Army of the Soviet Union was forging both its victory and its tragedy. The turning tide in the East. By 1942, Hitler's armies had devoured vast swaths of the Soviet Union. Entire cities lay in ruins, and millions of civilians starved as German tanks pushed deeper into the Russian steppe. For Hitler, Stalingrad was more than a strategic city. It was a symbol. To capture a city that bore Stalin's very name would break the Soviet will. But Stalin ordered his generals with a chilling simplicity, not a step back. The siege of Stalingrad became a nightmare. Written in fire and blood, civilians fought house to house, snipers hunted in the shadows, and soldiers froze in basements gnawed by hunger. Eyewitness accounts describe nights when the Volga River ran red with both blood and oil, as the Germans bombed it relentlessly to cut off Soviet supply lines. And yet, through this chaos, the Red Army clung to the ruins like wolves refusing to die. Case study, Vasily Zaitsev, the ghost of Stalingrad. Amid the rubble rose one of the war's most haunting figures, Vasily Zaitsev, a shepherd-turned-sniper, with a keen eye and an iron will. Zaitsev is credited with killing over 200 enemy soldiers. During the battle, his duel with German ace sniper Major Knig became legendary. A psychological war within a war. For the Soviets, Zaitsev was more than a soldier. He was proof that a single man could hold back an empire. But the true power of Stalingrad wasn't in one man's rifle. It was in the sheer will of the Soviet people. Backed by the brutal machine of the state, Stalin's infamous Order No. 227, not one step back, meant retreat was punishable by death. Soldiers often fought knowing that if they fled, they would be executed by their own comrades. It was survival by defiance, victory forged through terror. Operation Uranus, the Trap Springs. By late 1942, the tide turned. The Soviets launched Operation Uranus, encircling the German Sixth Army in a colossal pincer movement. Over 300,000 German soldiers found themselves trapped in a frozen death cage. Supplies dwindled, and corpses piled up in the snow. Hitler refused to let them surrender, declaring that the Sixth Army must fight to the last bullet. In the end, only about 90,000 Germans were taken prisoner, and barely 5,000 of them would survive the brutal Soviet camps to return home after the war. The rest vanished into the frozen soil of Russia. Stalingrad was no longer just a battle. It was the moment the Reich began to crumble. The Soviet shadow over Europe. The victory at Stalingrad was more than a military triumph. It marked the rise of the Soviet Union as a superpower in the making. The Red Army had shown the world that Hitler could be stopped. And from that point on, Soviet influence began seeping westward, laying the foundation for the Iron Curtain that would later divide Europe. But within the victory was also a seed of fear. Western leaders Roosevelt and Churchill watched uneasily as the Red Army pushed forward. Yes, the Soviets were allies, but what would happen once the Nazis were gone? Would Stalin's armies stop at Berlin or march further into Europe? The Red Army's brutal reputation as the war shifted in favor of the Allies. Stories began to spread of the Red Army's ruthlessness. Villages recaptured from German hands bore witness to unspeakable atrocities. Civilians often saw the Soviets as liberators and monsters at once driving out the Nazis, but replacing terror with terror. Historians still debate the full extent of these crimes, but one fact remains undeniable. The Soviet victory in the East was bought not only with the blood of soldiers, but also with the suffering of millions of innocents caught in the path of the Red Army. Prelude to the Cold War. By the time American troops stormed Normandy in 1944, the Soviets were already deep in Eastern Europe. They liberated Warsaw, Prague, and Budapest, not to hand them back, but to keep them under Moscow's shadow. The seeds of future conflict were planted here, in the ruins of Nazi cities and the silence of mass graves. The victory at Stalingrad had saved Europe from Nazi domination, but it also opened the door to a new empire rising in the East, one that would challenge the West for decades to come. Outrow, a foreshadow of collapse, the Red Army stood unchallenged, their banners waving in Berlin. By 1945, but behind the parades and the glory, the Soviet Union bore scars that would one day rip it apart: famine, repression, and a system held together more by fear than by unity. The fire that defeated Hitler would, in time, consume the USSR itself. In the next episode, we'll dive deeper into how the Soviet Union, triumphant in 1945, began walking a slow path toward collapse. From Stalin's iron fist to the cracks that widened after World War II, the Red Empire's fate was sealed long before the Cold War began. Part 3: The Fall of the Reich and the Dawn of a New World, when the Red Army clawed its way back. From the ashes of Stalingrad, the Nazi dream of a 1,000-year Reich had already begun to wither. But Hitler refused to accept defeat. The war machine of Germany still thundered across Europe, and as 1943 gave way to 1944, the bloodiest phase of the conflict was yet to come. The Western Front opens. While the Soviets ground down the Wehrmacht in the East, pressure mounted for the Allies to open a second front. Stalin demanded it, fearing that the USSR alone would bleed itself dry, while Britain and the US remained relatively unscathed. And so, on June 6, 1944, the world witnessed the largest amphibious invasion in history, D-Day. The beaches of Normandy became a crucible of fire. American, British, and Canadian soldiers waded through machine gun fire, artillery, and barbed wire. Thousands fell within hours. Yet by the day's end, the Allies had secured their foothold in Europe. Hitler's fortress was breached, but while the West celebrated the liberation of Paris and the march toward the Rhine, the real slaughter was still raging farther east. For every Allied soldier who died in France, dozens perished in the fields of Poland and the forests of Belarus. It was the Soviet Union that bore the heaviest burden, and the Red Army's shadow was stretching inexorably toward Berlin. Case study: the Warsaw Uprising, abandoned by Allies in August 1944. As Soviet forces reached the outskirts of Warsaw, the Polish resistance rose up against Nazi rule. Believing liberation was at hand, for 63 days, they fought with homemade weapons and undying courage. But the Red Army, camped just across the Vistula River, never intervened. Stalin waited as the Nazis crushed the uprising, killing nearly 100,000 Poles. Why? Historians argue it was a calculated move. A free Poland, led by non-communist resistance, threatened Soviet plans to dominate Eastern Europe by allowing the Nazis to exterminate Poland's independent fighters. Stalin ensured that when the Red Army finally liberated Warsaw, it would be his puppets who took power. The Warsaw Uprising was not just a tragedy, it was a foreshadowing of the Cold War, where liberation often meant replacing one master with another. The Eastern Avalanche: by early 1945, the Red Army surged westward with unstoppable force. Entire German divisions were annihilated, towns were burned, civilians fled in terror, and whispers spread of vengeance, Soviet soldiers avenging the horrors of the Nazi invasion. With equal brutality, mass rapes, executions, and looting stained the path of liberation for ordinary Germans. The advancing Soviet tide felt less like salvation and more like Judgment Day. Diaries of survivors describe cities where churches burned, families hid in cellars, and the sound of Soviet artillery was the soundtrack of the apocalypse. The fall of Berlin, April 1945. The world's deadliest war reached its climax in the ruins of Berlin. The Red Army encircled the city, bombarding it into dust. Hitler, delusional and ravaged by paranoia, raved in his bunker about phantom armies that no longer existed. The fighting was savage. Block by block, building by building, children of the Hitler Youth, barely teenagers, threw themselves against Soviet tanks with Panzerfaust. SS fanatics fought to the last bullet, and yet it was hopeless. On April 30, 1945, Hitler put a gun to his head and ended the nightmare he had unleashed. 2 days later, Soviet troops raised the red banner over the Reichstag. The symbol was immortalized in a photograph that became an icon, the hammer and sickle flying above the heart of the fallen Reich. Case study: the Yalta Conference, allies or rivals? Just months before Berlin fell, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met in Yalta to plan the post-war order. Officially, it was about peace. In reality, it was about power. Roosevelt sought Soviet help against Japan, knowing an invasion of the Japanese mainland would be catastrophic. Churchill feared Soviet expansion, but was too weakened to resist. Stalin demanded recognition of his control over Eastern Europe. In Yalta, the world was carved up before the blood had even dried. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and more would soon fall behind the Iron Curtain. It was here that the seeds of the Cold War were sown, disguised as diplomacy, victory, and devastation. May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. The streets of London, Paris, and Moscow erupted in celebration. The nightmare was over, but the cost was almost unbearable. 27 million Soviets dead. 6 million Jews exterminated in the Holocaust. Entire cities: Dresden, Hiroshima, Nagasaki reduced to ash, economies shattered, populations displaced, continents scarred. For the United States, the war ended with unprecedented power, its industries booming, its homeland untouched, and its atomic bomb proving a terrifying new dominance. For the Soviet Union, victory came at unimaginable cost, but it emerged as a giant occupying half of Europe, feared and respected in equal measure. The Nazi Reich was gone, but peace was fragile, and already the lines of the next conflict were etched across the globe. Outro: from allies to adversaries, World War II ended not with unity, but with division. The Allies had triumphed, but the partnership between the United States and the Soviet Union was a fragile illusion. Behind the smiles of victory lay mistrust, fear, and ambition. In the next episode, we will dive into the uneasy aftermath. How did Russia and America, once allies against Hitler, transform into bitter rivals locked in a struggle for global supremacy? From the ashes of Berlin to the deserts of New Mexico, the Cold War was born the moment the guns of World War II fell silent.